My name is Alina Walsh, and the man who thought he owned everything was my husband. Donald Payne believed power lived in volume, in public rooms, in loud decisions made without witnesses. He believed money obeyed whoever spoke with the most confidence. For 8 years, he believed I was background noise in his life, a quiet presence who existed to steady him, not to challenge him. This story begins on a Tuesday afternoon when Donald decided to erase me, and discovered instead that he had never been in control of anything at all. Donald was not at home when he made his decision. He was on a chartered yacht off the coast of Florida, surrounded by water, luxury, and the kind of silence that only exists when you think nothing can touch you. He had planned that moment carefully. The timing, the audience, the gesture. He needed someone to watch him assert dominance. That person was Sloane Rivers, a woman whose job was to be seen and admired, a woman Donald believed represented the life he deserved. She sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, waiting for proof that he could end one life and begin another without consequences. Donald picked up his satellite phone and smiled before dialing. He was calm, almost bored, the way people are when they think the outcome is guaranteed. He told Sloane to watch. He said this would be quick. He said I would understand my place by the end of the day. Then he called Reed Harper, his chief of staff, and gave the order that he believed would finish me. He told Reed to cancel all my credit cards. He told him to freeze every joint account. He said he wanted me desperate, unable to move, unable to fight. He said that by nightfall, I would have no choice but to sign whatever he put in front of me. Donald expected obedience. He expected reassurance. He expected to hear confirmation that the world still bent when he pushed. What he heard instead was silence. Not the respectful silence of compliance, but something heavier, slower, and wrong. Reed did not answer right away. When he did speak, his voice had changed. It was careful, controlled, and no longer deferential. Reed told him the cards could not be canceled. He said the accounts could not be frozen. He said there was nothing left to restrict. Donald laughed at first, assuming this was confusion, assuming Reed simply needed clarification. He repeated the order louder, sharper, reminding Reed who he was. That was when Reed told him about the call he had received earlier that morning, the call from me. Reed explained that I had invoked a clause in a partnership agreement Donald barely remembered signing. He explained that I had provided documentation of Donald's personal spending, his unauthorized withdrawals, and his misuse of company funds. He explained that the operating capital had already been moved. Every dollar, $150 million, gone. Donald did not respond immediately. The phone slipped from his hand and hit the deck. Sloane stopped scrolling. She checked her own phone, then checked again, her expression shifting from irritation to panic. Her card had declined. That was the moment Donald understood that this was not a misunderstanding. This was not a delay. This was execution. The yacht's engines cut shortly after. The crew began following protocol. The music stopped. The champagne disappeared. Donald stood frozen, staring at the water, trying to locate the version of reality where this could still be reversed. Then he screamed. Not in anger, not in rage, but in shock. It was the sound of a man realizing that everything he believed about ownership, authority, and marriage was false. He had tried to starve me into submission. What he did not understand was that the quiet person in the room is often the one holding the keys. Donald's scream did not change anything. It did not reverse the transfer, restore the accounts, or bring the engines back to life. It only confirmed to everyone on that yacht that the man they were watching no longer mattered. The crew moved without looking at him, following procedures that did not include his opinion. The captain informed him that the charter payment had failed and that the vessel was returning to port immediately. Donald tried to argue, then tried to threaten, but the words had no weight. Power leaves quietly when it goes. Sloane was already pulling away from him. She was not shouting or accusing him. She was doing something far worse. She was calculating. She checked her phone again, then stood up, distancing herself physically, as if proximity itself could become a liability. She asked one question, short and sharp. Why was her card declined? Donald told her it was a mistake. Even as he said it, he knew she would not believe him. Back on land, things unraveled faster than Donald could react. His phone filled with notifications he could not open and calls he could not return. He tried reaching his executives. One did not answer. Another sent him to voicemail. When his lawyer finally picked up, the call was brief and cold. There was an emergency board meeting. Auditors were present. The discussion was no longer about restructuring. It was about exposure. By the time the yacht docked, Donald no longer looked like someone in charge. He was required to sign documents acknowledging unpaid balances. His driver was gone. Sloane walked past him without a word and left in a car she ordered herself. She did not look back. The separation was immediate and absolute. Donald stood alone on the pier, holding a phone that no longer obeyed him, watching reporters gather before he even understood why they were there. The story had already escaped him. He whispered my name once, not in anger, but confusion. He did not yet understand how far back this had started or how carefully it had been prepared. What Donald did not know was that his collapse on the water was only the opening act. The money was gone, but the structure remained. The clauses he ignored were active. The evidence he dismissed had been collected. The silence he heard on that phone call was not hesitation, it was confirmation. 8 years earlier, when I chose not to be visible, I was not being passive. I was observing. I was documenting. I was waiting. Donald believed he was ending a marriage. In reality, he had triggered a system designed to respond to exactly the kind of man he had become. And while he was trying to understand how everything disappeared in a single afternoon, I was already moving forward. I was not on the yacht, and I was not watching the live footage when Donald lost everything. I was sitting at a desk, reading confirmations as they arrived, one after another, each one closing a door he believed was still open. I did not rush. I did not celebrate. This was not a moment that required emotion, it required accuracy. For most of our marriage, people described me using the same words. Quiet, supportive, low maintenance. Donald repeated those words often, especially when he wanted others to believe he had married beneath his ambition. He liked that image. A powerful man with a harmless wife. Someone who would never challenge him in public or in private. Someone who would never be suspected of control. That misunderstanding protected me for years. Donald never asked how I spent my days. He never read the agreements he signed if they came with good news. He never questioned why certain systems required my authorization. He assumed those were formalities, symbolic gestures meant to make me feel included. He mistook access for permission and proximity for ownership. The truth was simpler. I handled risk for a living long before I married him. I knew how power actually worked. I knew that loud men draw attention, and attention creates exposure. Donald loved exposure. He believed it validated him. I believed the opposite. I believed survival belonged to whoever stayed unnoticed longest. When Painwave first started to grow, Donald saw success as momentum. I saw it as instability. Growth attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny uncovers patterns. Patterns reveal behavior. Donald's behavior was always going to catch up to him. I only needed to make sure I was not standing in front of him when it did. That was why Orchard Arc Capital existed. Not as a favor, not as love, as a safeguard. Donald never understood that the money was structured to protect the investor, not the marriage. He never understood that I never give anything without an exit. When Reed became his chief of staff, Donald thought he had hired obedience. He thought Reed was there to manage schedules and smooth problems. What he never considered was loyalty to process. Reed did not work for charisma. He worked for structure, and structure answers to contracts, not personalities. The first time Reed sent me a flagged report, I did not act. I wanted to see how far Donald would go if he believed no one was watching. The second time, I began documenting. By the third, I was preparing, not to punish him, to contain him. Donald believed betrayal begins with emotion. Affairs, resentment, anger. That belief made him careless. Betrayal, in reality, begins with assumptions. His greatest mistake was assuming I needed him to survive. By the time he told Reed to cancel my cards, the system was already primed. The clause was active. The authority was clear. The transfer was legal. What he experienced as sudden loss was simply delayed consequence. Donald thought silence meant weakness. He never learned that silence is where decisions are made. And while he was standing on a dock trying to understand how he became irrelevant in a single day, I was preparing for the next phase. Because taking the money back was not the end of the story. It was only proof that the story had always belonged to me. Donald believed our story began when he noticed me at a fundraiser and decided I was different from the women who usually surrounded him. He liked to tell people that version. He said I was quiet, observant, and impressed by his ideas. What he never understood was that I had already been watching him long before he spoke to me. Before I became Donald's wife, I worked in financial risk strategy. My job was not to grow companies. It was to study how they failed. I analyzed balance sheets, executive behavior, and decision patterns. I learned early that numbers rarely destroy businesses. People do. Egos do. Shortcuts do. Donald was full of promise, but even then, I could see the flaw. He needed admiration more than accuracy. When we met, he talked about Painwave as if it were destiny. He spoke fast, confidently, skipping over details that didn't fit the story he wanted to tell. I challenged him once, gently, about a projection that didn't make sense. He laughed, surprised, then impressed. That reaction mattered. It told me he wasn't used to being questioned. It also told me he enjoyed it for the moment. I did not tell him who I was, not fully. I did not mention my background, my connections, or my access. I let him believe I worked in a narrow corner of finance. I wanted to see how he behaved when he thought I had nothing to offer except loyalty. That test lasted longer than I expected. In the early years, we were partners. We talked late into the night. He built ideas. I refined them. When he succeeded, he credited himself. When something failed, he blamed the market. That imbalance was small at first, almost harmless. I ignored it. Marriage changed the dynamic. Donald began to see success as proof of superiority. He stopped listening when I raised concerns. He called my caution pessimism. He started hiding numbers, then decisions, then entire conversations. He wanted applause, not analysis. The first major crisis came quietly. A loan fell through. Payroll was at risk. Donald came home panicked, convinced his life was over. He said the company needed money immediately. A large amount, more than he could raise publicly without admitting weakness. That was when I made the decision that defined everything that followed. I offered the money, not as a gift, as an investment, with conditions. Donald was too afraid to ask questions. He signed what I put in front of him because survival felt more important than understanding. Orchard Arc Capital became the solution he bragged about and the structure he ignored. He never read the clauses. He never asked why authority was divided the way it was. He was focused on one thing only: being saved. That was the moment the balance shifted. Donald believed he had been rescued. He never considered that rescue always comes with control. From that point on, the company recovered. Donald grew louder, more confident, more careless, and I stepped further back, letting him believe the danger had passed. What Donald did not realize was that the agreement he signed during his weakest moment would eventually meet him again at his strongest. The recovery gave Donald exactly what he wanted and took from him the one thing he needed: accountability. Once the money stabilized the company, the panic disappeared and something harder replaced it: certainty. Donald began to believe the crisis had proven his brilliance, not his dependence. He told people the investors had backed him because they believed in his vision. He never said my name. At first, I corrected him privately. I reminded him how close the company had come to collapse. I asked him to slow spending, to rebuild credibility before expansion. He listened just enough to nod, then did whatever he had already decided to do. The reports Reed sent me became more detailed, not because things were improving, but because irregularities were growing. Donald started treating company money as confirmation of status. Expenses appeared that did not align with growth or strategy, trips that produced no results, vendors that delivered nothing measurable. Each item alone was defensible. Together, they formed a pattern. A man rewarding himself for success he believed he had earned alone. The board did not see it. They saw rising numbers and a confident CEO. Investors like confidence. Employees follow it. Donald knew how to perform success better than anyone in the room. He was charming when it suited him and dismissive when it did not. People learned quickly not to ask difficult questions. At home, the shift was sharper. Donald stopped asking my opinion. He stopped explaining decisions. He began treating my silence as agreement. When I did speak, he accused me of undermining him. He said I didn't understand pressure. He said I didn't understand what it took to lead. What he meant was that I did not admire him the way he wanted. That was when he began to erase me. Invitations stopped. Public events became solo appearances. When journalists asked about his wife, he spoke vaguely, as if I were a background detail, not a partner. His mother reinforced it. She praised his ambition and questioned my usefulness. Donald never disagreed. Reed continued sending reports. I continued reading them. I did not intervene. I wanted to see how far Donald would push if he believed there were no limits. The answer arrived sooner than expected. The spending escalated. Payments routed through third parties. Charges miscategorized to avoid scrutiny. Reed flagged them quietly. I archived them carefully. The clause Donald ignored did not require emotion or intent. It required evidence, and evidence was accumulating. The final confirmation came not from a spreadsheet, but from a conversation I was never meant to hear. Donald and his mother discussed the future openly, assuming I was irrelevant. They talked about separation, about control, about money, about removing my access before I could react. That was when I understood something clearly. Donald did not see me as a risk because he never saw me as capable. He believed he could discard me the same way he discarded warnings and contracts. He believed power belonged to whoever acted first. He was right about one thing: action mattered. He just didn't realize I had already taken it. Once I accepted that Donald was no longer careless but deliberate, everything changed. This was no longer about ego or infidelity or disrespect. This was about containment. He was preparing to remove me, and he believed money was the only weapon required. That belief made him predictable. The agreement he signed years earlier had been designed for a moment like this. Orchard Arc Capital was not a passive investor. It had authority built into it, authority Donald dismissed as ceremonial. The moral and financial compliance clause was clear. Any misuse of company funds for personal benefit allowed immediate withdrawal of capital without notice. No negotiation, no delay. Reed knew this. He had known it from the beginning. That was why I chose him. He was not loyal to Donald. He was loyal to structure. He understood that contracts do not care who shouts the loudest. They only respond to triggers. When Reed first raised concerns about the spending tied to Sloan, I did not respond emotionally. I asked for documentation, dates, categories, payment paths. I wanted the entire trail clean enough to survive hostile review. Reed delivered exactly that. Invoices linked to shell vendors. Travel labeled as business that produced no business. Housing expenses hidden under executive logistics. Jewelry marked as client retention. It was enough. Still, I waited, not because I hesitated, but because timing mattered. Donald was planning to act soon. I needed him distracted, confident, unreachable. That opportunity came when he scheduled the yacht trip. He framed it as celebration. In reality, it was escape. He wanted distance when he executed his plan against me. While Donald packed for Florida, I prepared the system. Legal counsel reviewed the documentation. Auditors confirmed compliance. Reed secured internal authorization channels. Everything was staged to move fast and clean. No alerts until the balance dropped below threshold. No warning until it was irreversible. The night before he left, Donald behaved normally, too normally. He spoke about the future, about simplifying things, about needing space. He did not threaten, he did not argue. That restraint told me everything. He believed he had already won. What Donald did not know was that I had heard him planning my erasure. I had heard him describe me as weak, dependent, replaceable. I had heard him say I would be grateful for whatever he allowed me to keep. That conversation removed any doubt I had left. The morning his plane took off, I made one call. Not to confront him, not to warn him, to authorize execution. The transfer did not happen all at once. It moved through channels designed to protect capital from hostile seizure. By the time Donald reached the yacht, the process was already beyond interruption. His authority ended the moment the first confirmation cleared. He believed he was cutting me off. What he did instead was activate a mechanism he never understood. By the time he reached for the phone to cancel my cards, the company no longer belonged to him in any meaningful way. And he still had no idea what was coming next. Donald did not understand loss the moment it happened. He understood confusion first. Anger came later. By the time his plane landed back on the mainland, he still believed there had been a mistake somewhere in the system. He believed mistakes could be corrected if he reached the right person fast enough. He tried calling his executives from the airport. Most did not answer. One sent a short message telling him there was an emergency board session in progress. No details, no reassurance. That silence unsettled him more than the declined cards. When he finally reached his lawyer, the call lasted less than a minute. The lawyer told him auditors were already involved. External auditors. That word mattered. Auditors do not arrive unless someone has opened a door for them. Donald demanded to know who authorized it. The call ended before he received an answer. What Donald did not know was that the board meeting was not a debate. It was a formality. The evidence Reed delivered was complete. The spending trail was clear. The clause was explicit. The vote was procedural. By the time Donald left the airport, his access was already being reviewed. His badge privileges were suspended quietly. His administrative credentials were flagged. His ability to act was shrinking by the minute, though no one had told him yet. Sloane disappeared during that window. She did not argue. She did not demand explanations. She simply left. Her last message to Donald was brief and practical. She said she needed distance until things were stable. Stability, in her world, meant solvency. Donald no longer qualified. As the car took him toward the city, Donald's phone filled with alerts he did not open. News outlets were already publishing early versions of the story. No names yet. Just numbers, a missing amount, a company in default, questions about leadership. The narrative was forming without him. Donald still believed he could walk into the building and take control. That belief kept him moving. It kept him from understanding the scale of what had happened. He did not yet realize that authority does not vanish loudly. It dissolves through permissions, access, and silence. Inside the building, preparations were underway. Security protocols were updated. Executive access lists were revised. The name on the building was scheduled for removal, not as punishment, as correction. I arrived before he did. Not to hide, to observe. I did not enter his office. I did not touch his things. That space no longer mattered. The company no longer revolved around him. It revolved around exposure management. When Donald finally approached the building, he slowed. He noticed something was different before he could explain it. The entrance felt wrong. The atmosphere had shifted. People moved without acknowledging him. The recognition he relied on was gone. He stepped forward anyway, certain that proximity still meant control. He was about to learn how quickly systems close around someone who no longer belongs inside them. Donald reached the entrance believing momentum could still carry him through. It could not. His access card failed on the first attempt. He tried again, slower, as if patience might change the outcome. The red indicator did not blink. It stayed solid, final. Security approached him without urgency. They did not touch him. They did not argue. They asked for identification and instructed him to wait. That was the moment Donald understood something irreversible had happened. He was no longer being delayed. He was being contained. He demanded to speak to Reed. The name still felt like leverage in his mouth. The guard answered that Reed was unavailable and suggested Donald step aside. People walked past him without stopping. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked briefly, then away. He had become a problem no one wanted to claim. When Reed appeared, he did not apologize. He did not explain. He stated facts. The board had passed a resolution. Donald's authority was suspended pending investigation. His access was revoked effective immediately. Any attempt to enter restricted areas would be treated as a violation. Donald tried to argue. He raised his voice. He reminded Reed who hired him. Reed did not respond to that. He reminded Donald who signed the agreement. That was when Donald saw me. I did not approach him. I did not raise my voice. I told him the truth in a sentence he could not interrupt. He had ordered my cards canceled. I had ordered the capital withdrawn. Everything that followed was consequence. Donald accused me of betrayal. He said I had trapped him. He said this was personal. I corrected him. This was contractual. The difference mattered. He tried to appeal to the past. He mentioned early days, shared risks, sacrifices. I listened without reacting. Those memories had already been audited. They did not change the numbers. The police arrived shortly after, not for spectacle, for procedure. A warrant was presented. Evidence had been submitted. Fraud, forgery, and misappropriation were no longer internal matters. Donald looked at me one last time as they took him aside, not with anger, with disbelief. He still did not understand how completely he had misread me. He had mistaken restraint for dependence, silence for ignorance, distance for weakness. What he never understood was that the systems he used to build his image were the same systems that removed him when he violated their terms. As he was escorted out, phones were already recording. The story was live now, not the version he planned. The version supported by documents, recordings, and signatures he did not remember authorizing. I did not watch him leave. I turned away because the final phase was beginning. Exposure does not end when someone is removed. It ends when the truth is anchored so deeply that it cannot be rewritten. And Donald had given me everything I needed to make sure it never would be. The removal of Donald from the building did not end the danger. It clarified it. Men like him do not surrender when authority is taken away. They look for something they can still destroy. I knew that before Reed confirmed it. The alert came late that night. A bulk access log flagged by the internal system. Someone had initiated a full download from the core server's hours before Donald lost his credentials. The authorization key belonged to him. He had taken the one thing that still mattered, the proprietary engine, the algorithms that made the company valuable. Donald had always believed the company lived inside his head. Now he was trying to prove it. If he could not run it, he would sell it. If he could not control it, he would burn it. Reed told me where the data went, an external drive, offline, untraceable unless we moved quickly. Donald did not need money to hurt us anymore. He needed leverage, and leverage meant time. The next move came from him sooner than expected. He violated his release conditions and waited for me where he knew I would be. He looked different, not defeated, focused, dangerous in a quieter way. He did not shout, he did not threaten at first. He asked for a conversation. He said we could settle things privately. He said he wanted fairness. He said he wanted to walk away clean. The words were familiar. The intent was not. When I refused, he stopped pretending. He told me what he had taken. He told me where it was going. He named competitors. He described meetings he had already arranged. He believed that knowledge still gave him power. He said if I wanted the company to survive, I would need to give him something substantial. A settlement, immunity, silence. He framed it as negotiation. It was extortion. I did not respond immediately. I let him talk. Men like Donald reveal more when they believe they are still being heard. He admitted to downloading the files. He admitted to planning the sale. He admitted he would destroy everything if he could not benefit from it. That was enough. What Donald did not know was that the moment he took the data, he created another record, another trail, another violation. The system did not protect him. It documented him. I left without agreeing to anything. I did not warn him. I did not threaten him back. I did something far more dangerous. I let him believe he still had options. That night, I authorized the final response. Not retaliation, containment, the kind that closes every exit at once. Donald believed the worst was behind him because he had something I wanted. He did not understand that possession without protection is just evidence waiting to be collected. By morning, his last leverage would be gone. And he would finally understand that I never needed to destroy him. I only needed him to finish destroying himself. Donald believed the data he stole made him untouchable. That belief was the last illusion he had left. He assumed information alone created power. He ignored the fact that information without credibility only accelerates collapse. By the time he left that confrontation, the legal framework was already closing around him. Reed had preserved the access logs. The timestamps matched his travel window. The authorization key was his. There was no ambiguity. What Donald thought was a bargaining chip was a confession written in code. Still, I did not move publicly. I wanted him to act again. Desperation makes people careless, and Donald had always been careless when he thought speed mattered more than precision. Within 24 hours, he contacted a competitor. Not discreetly, not carefully. He used an intermediary he believed was loyal. That intermediary forwarded the message directly to us. Donald offered the core engine for a fraction of its value, framing it as a chance to cripple his former company overnight. He did not hide his motivation. He wanted revenge more than money. That offer triggered the response we were waiting for. I authorized Reed to release the sealed forensic package. Every log, every invoice, every recording. The attempted data theft was added as a final charge. The evidence did not suggest misconduct. It demonstrated intent. Law enforcement did not rush in immediately. They waited. They monitored. They allowed Donald to dig deeper, to make the mistake undeniable. When he attempted to move the data physically, they were ready. The arrest did not happen in public. It happened quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. Donald was informed of the charges: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, intellectual property theft, conspiracy. The list was long enough to remove negotiation entirely. When his lawyer called me later that evening, the tone was different. There were no threats, no demands, only questions. What would make this stop? What would make it easier? There was nothing left to discuss. Donald's narrative collapsed completely within the week. The media moved on from speculation to confirmation. His allies disappeared. His mother stopped speaking publicly. Sloan deleted posts and changed representation. Everyone adjusted their distance. Inside the company, stability returned faster than expected. Systems run better without sabotage. People work better without fear. The recovery was quiet, procedural, and permanent. I did not feel relief. I felt closure. Not because Donald was gone, but because the risk he represented had been neutralized fully. Donald once believed he could erase me by cutting off access. He believed survival depended on money he controlled. In the end, it was documentation, timing, and restraint that ended him. The story he tried to write about me never survived the evidence. And nothing he took with him survived scrutiny. Donald's arrest did not feel like an ending. It felt like a door closing behind us while something else remained unfinished ahead. Exposure removes a person, but it does not automatically restore what was damaged. I knew that if this story ended with him in custody, it would still be incomplete. The company's systems stabilized quickly, but the narrative outside did not. Questions kept coming, not about guilt. About origin. People wanted to know how a man they had trusted for years collapsed so completely and so fast. That curiosity was dangerous if left unmanaged. Curiosity creates speculation. Speculation creates revision. I did not allow that window. The board approved a controlled disclosure, not a performance, a sequence, documents released in phases, each one supported by timestamps and signatures, each one confirming that Donald's authority had always been conditional. There was no dramatic announcement, just confirmation layered over time until no alternate version could survive. Donald attempted contact from detention through intermediaries, not apologies, requests. He wanted statements adjusted, language softened, timelines blurred. He believed the right wording could still rescue him. I declined every message without response. Then came the final attempt. His legal team claimed there was a procedural flaw in the Orchard Arc agreement, a technical ambiguity. They requested arbitration, private, quiet. They hoped to drag the process into a space where influence mattered more than evidence. That was the moment I released the recording. Not the one already known, another, earlier, clearer. Donald discussing the plan to frame me, naming documents, describing how he would destroy my credibility to protect himself. It was not leaked, it was submitted. Arbitration was withdrawn within hours. Donald's leverage evaporated completely after that. The charges expanded. Bail conditions tightened. His access to communication was restricted. Even his own attorney began preparing for sentencing instead of defense. The company moved on. Leadership was reassigned. Governance restructured. Every safeguard Donald resisted was implemented permanently. No single authority. No unchecked access. No loyalty to personality over process. Painwave became something Donald never wanted it to be: stable. People asked me privately if it was difficult to dismantle someone I once loved. I did not answer them. The question assumed emotion was the driver. It never was. This was not revenge, it was risk resolution. Donald had spent years believing that relationships were assets he controlled. He never understood that the most dangerous relationship in his life was the one he dismissed entirely. By the time his trial date was set, the company no longer reacted to his name. Investors stopped asking about him. Employees stopped whispering. The system no longer recognized him as relevant input. That is the final consequence men, like Donald, never anticipate. They believe destruction comes loudly. In reality, it comes when nothing responds to them anymore. The trial date was set, but Donald did not wait for it. He tried one last move before the system closed completely. From inside detention, he contacted a former vendor who still believed loyalty could be exchanged for relevance. That message was intercepted within minutes. Donald asked for a favor. He wanted a statement drafted, something informal, something that suggested the data transfer had been authorized verbally during a prior restructuring phase. He believed a single document could reopen doubt. That attempt changed everything. The prosecution amended the charges to include witness tampering. The request was simple, careless, and recorded. Donald had not learned restraint. He still believed action mattered more than consequences. Once that charge was added, negotiation ended entirely. The court revoked his remaining privileges. His communications were limited to monitored channels. His legal team stopped calling me. They started calling each other. Outside, the media shifted tone again. The story was no longer about a fallen executive. It was about intent. Pattern, design. Articles stopped using phrases like alleged and began using timelines. The public narrative hardened into something immovable. Inside the company, the last trace of Donald's influence disappeared. His name was removed from internal documentation. Legacy permissions were erased. Projects he once claimed as personal victories were reassigned without ceremony. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just replacement. That silence was intentional. Donald wanted spectacle. He wanted confrontation. He wanted the story to stay alive as long as possible. Silence denied him that. Silence forced him to sit with the fact that the world was continuing without him. The final evidence submission happened quietly. A consolidated file delivered to the court. It contained nothing new. That was the point. It showed continuity, consistency, no contradictions, no emotional framing, just actions linked to outcomes. Donald's defense collapsed under its own weight. They argued pressure, stress, poor judgment. None of it mattered. The record showed planning, repetition, and escalation. The court did not need interpretation. It had documentation. The verdict did not surprise anyone who had followed the evidence. Guilty on all major counts. Sentencing scheduled. Appeals noted but unsupported. The process moved forward without delay. I was not present in the courtroom when it happened. I did not need to be. The outcome had been decided long before the first hearing. It was decided the moment Donald assumed no one was watching. When I received the confirmation, I acknowledged it and closed the file. There were no follow-up actions required, no loose ends, no remaining exposure. Donald once believed power meant never having to ask permission. In the end, it meant never being asked for input again. And that was the most complete removal of all. Sentencing did not end Donald's presence immediately. It changed its form. He was no longer a decision-maker or a negotiator. He became a variable the system managed. His attempts to influence outcomes stopped because there was nothing left to influence. What remained was cleanup. During the final internal audit, Reed uncovered one unresolved risk: a secondary storage location registered under a defunct subsidiary. It had not been accessed since before Donald's arrest. At first glance, it looked irrelevant. Old backups, archived material. But patterns matter, and Donald always left patterns. We opened it. Inside were partial exports, not enough to rebuild the engine, but enough to explain his confidence. He had planned redundancy. If one copy failed, another would survive. That discovery mattered because it showed preparation beyond impulse. It confirmed intent at a level that closed any remaining argument. The files were logged, sealed, and added to the case record. Donald was notified through counsel. He responded once. He denied ownership, he denied knowledge, he denied everything. The denial contradicted previous statements. That contradiction mattered more than the denial itself. The court amended the sentencing recommendation. Outside the legal process, the consequences continued. Financial institutions closed remaining personal accounts. Creditors called in debts. Properties tied to misappropriated funds were seized. Donald's mother attempted to intervene publicly, then privately. Neither attempt lasted long. Without access or credibility, outrage becomes noise. Sloane tried once more to reposition herself. She released a statement claiming ignorance, manipulation, regret. The statement was ignored. No one needed her explanation anymore. She was not central to the outcome. She never had been. Inside the company, we completed the last structural change. Ownership was clarified, governance finalized, emergency controls made permanent. The system was no longer reactive. It was resolved. One afternoon, I received a message forwarded through legal counsel. Donald requested a personal meeting. No lawyers, no mediation. He said there were things only I could understand. He said he needed closure. I declined without explanation. That refusal mattered more than any confrontation. It removed the last illusion that he still had access to me. He had believed, until the end, that some version of our history entitled him to an audience. It did not. The final update arrived weeks later. Donald had accepted a plea agreement, reduced sentencing in exchange for cooperation on unrelated investigations. He named names, he provided records, he became useful in the only way he could now be. When the agreement was finalized, his case disappeared from headlines. No closing story, no redemption arc, just absence. That was the ending he never planned for. Not disgrace, not revenge, erasure. And once he was gone from the narrative entirely, the company, the system, and my life moved forward without any reference to him at all. Donald's cooperation did not soften his outcome. It only shortened the distance between consequence and silence. Once the agreement was signed, his value to anyone outside the system dropped to zero. He had traded information for time, but time without leverage is just waiting. What mattered now was insulation. Every system Donald once touched was reviewed again, not because something was wrong, but because certainty requires redundancy. We traced permissions back years, mapped dependencies, and closed pathways that should never have existed. Nothing dramatic surfaced. That was the confirmation. He had not hidden anything else. He had simply overestimated himself. Still, there was one risk left. Reputation does not obey contracts. It lives in memory, rumor, and narrative. If left unmanaged, it reshapes itself. That was where the final move happened. We released a comprehensive internal report to institutional stakeholders, not to the press, not to the public. To the people who mattered. The report did not accuse, it documented. It laid out the timeline from initial investment to removal. It showed structure, not emotion. Cause and response. Every decision tied to a clause, every action tied to evidence. Once that report circulated, the questions stopped. No one asked if Donald had been treated unfairly. No one asked if this was personal. The framework answered everything without commentary. It showed that the system worked exactly as designed. Donald attempted one last narrative shift from inside custody. He authorized an interview request through a third party. He wanted to tell his side. He claimed misunderstanding. He claimed betrayal. He claimed he had trusted the wrong people. The request never reached the press. Media interest had already moved on. Without contradiction, his version had no oxygen. Stories survive on friction. He had none left. The final severance came quietly. His name was removed from historical documents where it no longer applied. Not erased, but reclassified. Former executive, removed for cause. That line would follow him longer than any headline ever could. On a personal level, the silence deepened. Friends we once shared adjusted without asking. Invitations stopped arriving in pairs. My phone became quieter, cleaner, focused. That was when I understood the real shift had completed. Donald had believed power meant presence. He believed influence required noise. He believed silence was something inflicted on the weak. In reality, silence was the outcome of authority exercised fully. There were no confrontations left, no statements to issue, no responses required. The system no longer anticipated disruption. Everything Donald tried to break had adapted. And the last thing he lost was the ability to be remembered on his own terms. The final attempt did not come from Donald. It came from someone who believed the damage could still be redirected. A former board member contacted Reed late one evening, suggesting a quiet settlement. Not legal, not official. A mutual understanding. He argued that prolonged exposure served no one and that certain records could remain internal if cooperation was offered. That message was forwarded to me without comment. The problem with quiet settlements is that they assume uncertainty. There was none left. The evidence was closed. The outcomes were fixed. What this person was really asking for was insulation from association. Distance without consequence. I declined. That refusal triggered the last wave. Emails surfaced. Messages from people who had benefited indirectly from Donald's behavior. They did not defend him. They defended themselves. Each message revealed more than it intended. Each one confirmed what the audit had already shown. Complicity does not require intent. It only requires silence. Those messages were archived. Within days, 2 resignations followed. Then a third, no announcements, no explanations. They left before being asked to explain their positions. That was enough. The system corrected itself again. At the same time, Donald's plea agreement became public record. Not through a press release, through a filing, dry, unavoidable. It outlined his admissions clearly. Fraud, misrepresentation, unauthorized access, intent to sell proprietary assets, no emotional language, just statements tied to dates. That document ended any remaining debate. A week later, I received confirmation that the last appeal had been denied. The court cited procedural compliance and overwhelming evidence. There would be no reconsideration, no reduction, no reopening. Donald sent one final message through legal counsel after that decision. It was not a request. It was a statement. He said he finally understood how long this had been unfolding. He said he had underestimated me. He said he never thought silence could be strategic. I did not respond. Because understanding after consequence does not change the consequence. The company finalized its long-term governance plan shortly after. Independent oversight, external compliance, rotating authority, everything Donald resisted was now policy. The structure he believed slowed innovation had preserved it. When the final transition document was signed, Reed asked me if there was anything else to address. Any remaining exposure, any unresolved risk. There wasn't. Donald's name no longer appeared in active systems. His access was gone. His influence expired. His presence reduced to archived records and court filings. The story did not end with him leaving. It ended when nothing in the system anticipated his return. The last confirmation arrived without warning. A routine compliance update flagged a dormant account that should not have existed. It was small, inactive, and easy to overlook. That was why it mattered. Donald had always believed small things survived unnoticed. We traced it. The account had been opened years earlier under an internal pilot project. At the time, it looked harmless. A contingency wallet. Minimal balance, no activity. Until now, 2 microtransactions had been attempted from a foreign node less than 48 hours earlier. Both failed. Someone had tried to test the perimeter. The authorization pattern did not match Donald's known behavior. It was more cautious, more indirect, which meant someone else was moving. Not for him, because of him. We isolated the source within hours. A former mid-level engineer who had been removed quietly during the restructuring. Someone Donald had leaned on late in the collapse, promising protection that never came. The engineer had retained partial credentials Donald no longer had. That was the weakness. The intent was clear: reconstruct enough of the system to sell fragments, not the engine, pieces, documentation, implementation logic, anything that could be monetized before it was discovered. We let it continue for 12 hours. During that window, every attempt was logged, every request captured, every packet recorded. When the engineer reached out to a buyer, that communication was monitored too. The buyer was not a competitor. It was an intermediary, someone who believed anonymity meant safety. Once the path was complete, we closed it. Access was revoked. Devices were locked remotely. Authorities were notified with a complete package. No warnings were issued. No questions asked. The arrest happened at a workstation mid-session. That incident closed the last operational vulnerability. What it also confirmed was something else. Donald's collapse had created a vacuum. Vacuums attract opportunists. The only way to prevent that is finality, not fear, not punishment, closure. The company issued no statement. The arrest did not appear in the press. It did not need to. It was handled as a security breach. Nothing more. That night, Reed updated the final risk register. Every item was marked resolved, not mitigated, not monitored, resolved. Donald never learned about that incident. It was not mentioned in court. It was not added to his file. It no longer concerned him. His influence had shrunk so completely that even the damage caused by his shadow no longer carried his name. That was the real end. Not the sentencing, not the headlines, not the plea. The end was the moment the system stopped reacting to his existence at all. And nothing he touched after that survived long enough to matter. The silence that followed was different. Not the tense quiet of something unfinished, but the controlled stillness of a system that no longer expected intrusion. That was when the last consequence surfaced, not from inside the company, but from outside it. A federal investigator contacted our legal team with a narrow question. During Donald's cooperation, he had mentioned an offshore structure he once considered using if the company ever turned against him. At the time, the claim seemed speculative. Now it was being verified. The structure existed. It was dormant, underfunded, and incomplete, but it had been registered years earlier through an intermediary Donald trusted. It had never been activated because he believed he would never need it. The irony was precise. He prepared for external enemies and ignored the risk he lived with every day. The investigator wanted confirmation of one thing: whether any company capital had ever touched that structure. The answer was no. That mattered. It meant Donald's final contingency failed before it began. Still, the existence of the structure changed how the authorities viewed his intent. It reframed his actions not as panic, but as long-term preparation. That distinction mattered legally. The sentencing guidelines adjusted again. Donald was informed. He requested a review. He claimed the structure was theoretical, unused, abandoned. The records disagreed. He had paid for its maintenance. He had renewed it quietly. He had believed patience alone made it harmless. It did not. The adjustment added time, not symbolic time, real time. After that update, no further communication came from him, not through counsel, not through intermediaries. He had reached the end of available moves. There were no favors left to call in, no stories left to tell, no leverage left to misjudge. The company closed its final exposure report the same week. Every known path Donald created had been identified, every dependency removed, every contingency neutralized. There were no unresolved questions. I signed the last authorization digitally. The system acknowledged it and locked. That was when I allowed myself to stop watching. For years, attention had been a requirement. Observation had been survival. Preparation had been habit. Now it was no longer necessary. The threat was not paused, it was gone. Donald once believed that control meant always having an exit. He never realized that exits only matter if someone is chasing you. And no one was anymore. The last development came quietly, disguised as routine paperwork. A sealed notice arrived from the court confirming that all related investigations connected to Donald had been formally closed. Not paused, not pending. Closed, that distinction mattered. It meant no additional evidence was expected, no further cooperation required, no remaining threads worth pulling. For most people, that would have felt like relief. For me, it was confirmation. Closure does not arrive with emotion, it arrives with finality. Donald had entered the system believing he could bend it. He exited it as a resolved case file. Every contingency he believed might protect him had either been exposed or rendered irrelevant. His name now appeared only in completed records, referenced in the past tense, attached to outcomes he could no longer influence. Inside the company, we performed one final test. A controlled failure simulation designed to see how the structure responded under stress. It passed, authority rerouted cleanly. Access controls held. No single individual had the ability to destabilize operations. That was the architecture Donald had resisted most. The irony was unavoidable. The company became stronger only after removing the man who believed he was its foundation. There was one last inquiry. A journalist reached out requesting comment on how it felt to dismantle someone I once trusted. The question assumed emotion had been the engine. I declined to answer, not because it was personal, but because the premise was wrong. This was not dismantling a person. It was dismantling risk. Donald's sentence began shortly after. No cameras, no statements. He entered a system that does not respond to confidence, reputation, or excuses, only compliance, only time. The man who once believed rules were suggestions was now defined entirely by them. I did not follow his transfer. I did not track his adjustment. That information no longer served a purpose. The chapter was closed because nothing new could emerge from it. What remained was clarity. The quiet that followed was not emptiness, it was space. Space to operate without interference. Space to move without anticipation. Space to exist without preparing for someone else's instability. Donald had spent years believing I was passive because I did not announce my intentions. He believed action required performance. In the end, the only performance that mattered was the one he never saw coming. And when everything was finished, there was nothing left to confront, nothing left to defend, and nothing left to explain. Only a system that worked. The world did not react to Donald's disappearance the way he once imagined it would. There was no vacuum, no chaos, no moment where someone asked what would happen without him. The systems adjusted, the schedules filled, and the decisions continued. His absence did not register as loss, it registered as resolution. That realization reached him later, through channels he could no longer control. Old contacts stopped responding, messages went unanswered. Names that once opened doors now produce silence. Not hostility, not rejection, indifference. Indifference is more precise than punishment. Inside the company, a final review was conducted to close historical dependencies. Projects Donald once claimed as personal victories were traced back to teams he had sidelined. Those teams were reinstated, credited, and empowered. The correction was subtle but permanent. History was not rewritten, it was completed. A long-term audit revealed something unexpected. Productivity had increased during the period of instability, not decreased. People worked faster when fear was removed. Decisions improved when ego was no longer protected. That data mattered more than any statement ever could. Donald learned this indirectly when one of his former allies testified during an unrelated inquiry. The testimony was not malicious, it was factual. The ally described Donald as unpredictable, image-driven, resistant to oversight. The description matched the records. The court accepted it without reaction. That was when Donald's narrative fully collapsed, not because it was attacked, but because no one defended it anymore. He attempted one last correspondence, a letter handwritten, sent through approved channels, It was not angry. It was reflective. He wrote that he finally understood how long he had been mistaken. He admitted he had confused control with noise, loyalty with fear. He said he saw now why I had always been quiet. The letter ended without a request. I did not respond. Not because I lacked compassion, but because response implies continuity. There was none left. The final confirmation came months later when his sentence was officially entered into permanent record. No appeals pending. No motions outstanding. The case number was archived, the file closed. That was the moment the story stopped moving. Donald was no longer a variable, he was data. And once someone becomes data, they no longer threaten the system that contained them. The end did not announce itself. It arrived the way everything else had, through confirmation rather than confrontation. A final system update marked all related cases closed, all contingencies cleared, all permissions sealed. No alerts followed, nothing required attention. That was how I knew it was finished. Donald existed now only as reference material. His name appeared in archived agreements, court records, and audit trails. It no longer triggered review protocols or risk flags. It no longer required monitoring. The system did not anticipate him because it did not need to. The company moved forward without acknowledging the transition. That absence was intentional. Success did not depend on declaring victory. It depended on not recreating the conditions that required intervention in the first place. I watched the quarterly review proceed without deviation. Decisions were made, challenged, and approved without tension. No one deferred out of fear. No one performed for authority. The structure held, that was the final proof. There was no moment where I looked back, not because I forgot what happened, but because nothing behind me was unfinished. Every decision that mattered had already been executed. Every outcome had already been secured. Donald once believed that power lived in visibility. He believed being seen meant being safe. In the end, visibility was what removed him. Every action he took left a record. Every shortcut created a timestamp. Every assumption became evidence. What survived was not emotion or memory, but structure. The last communication related to him came from compliance, a routine notice confirming retention schedules. Records would be preserved, access restricted, no further action required. I acknowledged it and closed the interface. That was it. There was no confrontation to replay, no words left unsaid that needed recovery. The story ended not with reconciliation or regret, but with certainty. The kind that does not ask questions because all of them have already been answered. Donald tried to starve me into submission by cutting access he never owned. He believed dependency was my weakness. He never understood that restraint was my strategy. By the time he realized the system did not answer to him, it no longer answered about him either. And that is how it ended. Not with noise. With nothing left to respond to. You have reached the end of the text.